So it's really terrific to be here, and as the minister said, thank you for this weather, because I come from the rainy Pacific Northwest, and so it makes me feel right at home. I've heard that it's sunny here, and I've seen out in Melbourne. I've seen the tennis, Australian Open tennis. It looks like it's sunny, but I have yet to have any personal data points about a sun here. It's not been here in the 2 days that I've been here, so I'm hoping for some replication, an experimental replication of that here. Today we're going to talk about in these opening minutes some of the work that I do for my legislature. I have a great job, and it's really a fantastic job, so I get to tell you about my job today. I'm not interviewing for a job, I'm just telling you about my great job. So I get to do two things. There's a world of research out here, right? Many of you here are researchers. You do criminological research, you might do other kinds of research. That world out there, academics, journal publications, petty jealousies, publications, going to conferences, all that kind of stuff is out here. And then there's the world of policy making in various bodies. Here in New South Wales at the federal level here, national level here in my state legislature, this is a different world than this world. These are two worlds. The world of how decisions get made in a political context. You don't get trained on how to get along in that world. You get along in that world by being in that world. My job, my legislature that works in this world has hired me to try to bridge these two worlds, to make them not collide, but actually come up and bring those two bodies of evidence, how decisions actually get made with the world of real research, put them together and see if we can do something for the citizens of my state, Washington State, that's a good thing. So today we're going to be talking about reducing crime and saving money. All members of my legislature, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, want lower crime. You could ask all the members, do you want more crime? Nobody would stand up. Everyone wants lower crime. And especially these days in my state, around the country, around the world, not so much apparently in Australia, although I think you're on the way, saving money in budgetary terms is very, very important, something we have to do. Our legislature is going to convene next week for a special session where we have to cut another couple $2 billion out of our budget. So it's very important to try to bring evidence to bear on making the right kinds of decisions that allow you to get lower crime for the people of my state and of Australia or your country, and to do so in a way to save money. So we're going to talk about how we're going about doing that in Washington State and some of the success that we've had, some of the things we've learned in our evolving approach. The general concept, the subtitle of this thing is you got to switch. This is investment 101 I'm talking about here. If you don't have any more money and you want to get a better objective, in this case reduce crime, what you have to do is you got to do the numbers, and you've got to take things you're doing now that might be reducing crime but that cost too much. You've got to abandon some of those resources and switch them into things that have a higher return on investment. More crime avoided per dollar of spending. That's the only way you can kind of accomplish those two things, is to rearrange your portfolio of crime-fighting resources. And that's really what we've been doing for our legislature. So just a little bit about what I do. The state legislature, first of all, I'm from Washington State, which is out over on that side, not Washington, D.C. We have the same name, but that's, of course, the nation's capital. We're out there on that. This is we call the other Washington. This is the real Washington. And that's part of our federal tension, the same kind of tension you have in here. It's in our Constitution, been there for 230 years or so, tension between the federal government and what the states run. As it is in Australia, as I understand, the states run the criminal justice systems. We have 50 criminal justice systems. You think of the United States, but we have 50 criminal justice systems. The federal governments do a little bit in crime and a little bit in other areas of social policy, but the states, by our Constitution, largely run the criminal justice system. So I'm going to be talking about my state of Washington there and how it sort of fits into the overall picture of what we've been doing there. But it's out over on that side. There's Olympia, taking a picture on one of our rare sunny days there in the Northwest there. That's the state capitol. That's Saltwater. That's the bottom of Puget Sound. That's the Capitol building. Seattle, the better known Washington City, is just off to the picture there. We're kind of looking north. Patricia's City, Vancouver, is farther up there to the north. My institute's right there. It serves the legislature. And if you're ever interested, if I say anything today that you get angry about and you want to come and visit me, my house is right there. So you can come and we can talk about it, and that kind of thing. Have a cup of coffee, whatever. And it's very important. It's very important that my house is right there, because I'm going to talk about numbers a lot today. Half of what I do is the numbers stuff. The other half is how do you interpret those numbers for those people in that political world that make decisions inside that Capitol. So every day I walk to work and I walk back home to work and I testify at that Capitol many times a session. But when I do those informal walks through the Capitol, there I see people, see staffers, legislative committee staffers, see members of the legislature. We talk. Sometimes about how the tennis is going in the Australian Open, and sometimes about policy stuff. And it's those informal things where a lot of the information gets communicated and the trust gets built up over time between you and members here. So again, these two worlds out here are encapsulated. I like to show this picture because I don't work in academic journals. I work right there. Those every year decisions get made, budgets get passed out of that Capitol, affecting the 7 million people that live in Washington State. The Institute is a nonpartisan institute. It's not a member of any one political party. It's governed actually by both political parties in equal numbers. So it was designed that way in 1983 to be a nonpartisan source of independent advice to the legislature. All the projects that we get come to us when our legislature writes a bill, signed into law by the governor, and it says study something. In fact, what we've been asked to do in more recent years is to this general investment advice role. We've been asked to say what works and what doesn't work, what does research indicate works and what doesn't work, and even kick it up a notch from there. Let's do a cost-benefit analysis so that we know where per dollar of taxpayer spending you get the best bang for the bucks. And in the areas of government policy that we've been asked to look at, I've listed there in the blue, along with the dates of the legislative assignments. So crime has been one of our main focuses, and that's what we're talking about today. But we also do work in many of the other areas of public policy, mainly the education system, child abuse and child welfare system, and substance abuse, and the other areas that you can see up there as well. So the same general approach that I'm going to be talking about today in crime, we take in all these other areas. It's the same methodology to go about trying to figure out what works and what's cost beneficial. And the model we have put together, which we'll talk about tomorrow in another session in more detail, goes to doing that kind of work. So that's sort of what the Institute is. I put together one quick little slide here just to kind of give a comparison of some things. The U.S. population is 310 million. Australia is 23. The United States, Washington State is 7 million. So Washington State is a pretty much average-sized state. It's about just a little bit smaller, I think, than New South Wales, a little bit larger than Victoria. So I work for a body that's about the same size as New South Wales and Victoria and give advice to that group there. I don't do it at the federal level and so on. Per capita, we're both all kind of wealthy, pretty well-off states relative to the rest of the world. Inequality, I don't have a state number here for my state, but as you know, the whole Occupy movement, especially in the United States, is all about the growing inequality of incomes, and you can see it demonstrated by the ratio there. The higher the numbers, the more inequality, and we're considerably more unequal than you are here in Australia. If you look at taxes, mortality rates, I have some of it there. You have much lower, quite a bit lower infant mortality rate than we do in the United States or in my state. Life expectancy about the same. Where we're really different? Incarceration, we love to put people in prison apparently because we've got the United States as a whole has the world's highest incarceration rate. We're the leading jailer in the world. This has been a development over the last 20 to 30 years that we've become that. My state has also grown, as we'll see in a moment, in incarceration. We're considerably less punitive than the average state in the U.S., but we're a lot more punitive than you are here in Australia. I didn't put it into the individual states here in Australia, so that's a national number. I don't know how it breaks out. And then the murder rate, you have a lower murder rate here by considerable magnitude than we do in my state, which is lower than the national average for the U.S. as a whole. Murder rates have come down significantly across the U.S. and in my state as well. So just a little comparison. Again, the key one there is probably population-wise. I serve a legislature in a state that's about the size of some of your leading states here in this country, the largest states in your country. One more thing, on the big picture, so crime. Now let's shift all that stuff into crime. Here's really, when I think about what our legislatures ask, this is really, they don't do it on this chart, but this is what they're asking me to do. Let's do a chart. From 1980, and we'll plot some numbers out there. I'm an economist. We like to give good news and bad news. We're going to see how things have changed since 1980. This is the earliest data that we have on some of these trends. Here's the good news. The good news, crime rates are down. They're down in general throughout the United States and in my state in particular. This is data through 2009. I have 2010. The rates are down a little bit more. About 43% less likely to be a victim of a serious crime. They're down that much since 1980. This is fantastic news. These are serious felony, violent, and property crimes. So if you visit Seattle today, you have about almost a 50% less chance of being a victim than had you visited back in 1980. So that's just unambiguously good news. You have to be really, really happy about that news. We're less crime victimization, less amount of crime in our state than there used to be. Great news. Here's the bad news. The bad news is that the amount of money that we as taxpayers have been spending to fight crime has gone up, has more than doubled over that period. So I took all the money that we spend for police, through local, we have a local and a state system in our state, a local juvenile court system, the criminal sections of the prosecutor's office, the court personnel that handles criminal cases, all the juvenile cases, all of the adult cases, all the sanctions, all the prisons we've built, all those dollars. I added them all up, take inflation out, so these are in real dollars, and divide by the number of households in the state. And what you find is that we used to take $575 a household a year back in 1980, and now it's up over $1,200. So we've more than doubled the real amount of money that we take from taxpayers to pay to fight crime. And part of the reason that the blue line is down is that we're spending more money. All the money has not been wasted. We built a lot of prison cells, especially during the 80s and 90s, and prison cells will help you reduce crime if you put the right kind of people in prison. If you just through incapacitation alone, you will reduce crime, possibly through crime deterrence as well. If you put more police on the street, there's evidence that you'll reduce crime as well. So part of the reason that the blue line is down, the good news, is that we've been spending more money. And that's a matter of policy calls throughout our state government. What we want to do, however, this is getting to be very painful. This green line is painful anyway, but it's especially painful in tough budget times. So what we want to do is that turn that we're starting to see in our numbers, and this is a real optimistic sign that some of the policies we're putting into place are starting to turn that curve, bend the curve, as they like to say in health care these days. We're starting to see some of the policies pay off here. If we could have a chance to come back here to Sydney a few years from now, what I'd like to be able to say is that crime rate continuing to go down. We don't want it to go back up as we start to cut things in our budget. But what we really want to do is to figure out how to turn that green curve around without jeopardizing our crime rate. And so that's what I say, the only solution to this is to try to find ways that give you a better return on your crime-fighting dollar than what we're currently doing. So that means all the incarceration policies that drove this line up, and in part for the reason this time to go down. We have to find out better alternatives than that, if they exist, and put them into place. And so far, I think we're putting a bunch of those in place in Washington, and we're starting to see some of the results show up on that green line, and some of the results show up on some things I'll talk about in just a moment. So when we get asked this, so now I'm going to talk about picking them, passing them, doing them, and holding them accountable. And by them, I mean sort of evidence-based programs, policies that can reduce crime. So we got to learn how to pick those kind of policies. We got to learn how to get them through a legislature, how things happen there. We got to do them. We got to have them actually done with fidelity and so on. And then we have to hold them accountable and make sure that we're going to do it. So this is really what we do. When we get that first assignment on picking them, this is the procedures we've developed. The formal procedures we'll talk in great detail about tomorrow in the session. This is just an overview. The first thing we do is we go out and we read all the literature we can. We're out within our investment advisor role looking out across the world for who has done serious research, credible research, random assignment research, the best quasi-experimental research, rigorous research in the real world on things that reduce crime. So I read everything. I go out, I read a lot of stuff from Australia, some of which are in our results, some of which I think is lousy research. I threw it out. Same way around the country. I love it if I can get a Washington State study, but I'm out looking for anybody that's done something that I think we might be able to import into my state and make an effective use of policy. So we use a meta-analytic strategy here. We get all the research we can, as we'll see in a second, and try to get an average effect. We then kick it up a notch. If we have something that we think it can work, we want to know what are the economics of that option. And so we've built a formal cost-benefit model. We'll talk about that one tomorrow. I'll actually run it a little bit tomorrow. to add up the benefits to, in this case, to crime outcomes, the taxpayers. If crime goes down, we shouldn't have to spend as much money, so we have to figure out how to calculate that. And if crime goes down, it means there'll be fewer victims, and so we want to put a price tag on that as well. So those are the benefits, and then we stack them up against the cost, and we come up with a list of what works. And then in the third and final stage, we go what investment people will tell you to do. They go portfolio. It's nice to have a list about what works, but what you really want to know is how many of these things do you want to buy? How many slots of programming do you want to buy? How many prison cells do you want to buy? What's the total portfolio? And so that's where you start to balance the resources. So this is what we've, Investment Analysis 101, this is what we do for our legislature and what we've done here. When we get all done, we do consumer reports. So I know in America, there's a magazine called Consumer Reports. Everyone's used to it. Everyone knows it in the U.S. You might have a similar magazine in Australia. I don't know. They have one called Which in the U.K. And so if you want to know about cameras or lawnmowers or cars or anything like that, people go buy this stuff, and they're used to seeing the little charts there. They know how to read them. Everyone's read this from decades. They know how to read them. They look at the rankings. Consumer Reports. Doesn't take advertising, so it's thought to be an unbiased source of things. That's what basically the business I'm in for the legislature. It's producing consumer reports, not about cars and cameras, but about what works to reduce crime or what works to getting increased high school graduation and so on. When we get all done, that's what our report looks like. I try to make it look the same. This is part of getting it to be useful for legislators. The report looks the same. We rank things just like Consumer Reports does. We use criteria on the return on investment to rank options. We'll talk about some of these in just a second. But that way, if a member is sitting on the Education Committee, they see a similar kind of report ranked about how do you get more kids to graduate from high school? What about paying teachers for graduate degrees? What about all class size and so on? If we're looking at crime, there's a bunch of things that we think we can do that work and that don't work, and that evidence indicates, and there's some things that we don't know about yet. But the basic idea here is to have a format that members of the legislature can actually get used to seeing and trusting, just like they do Consumer Reports. That's the grand enterprise experiment that we've been trying to do in public policy, and so far I think it's starting to pay off. Members are starting, increasing number of the 148 members of the Washington State Legislature, elected members, use this kind of information to actual form policies. It's been a slow development. We're at it for about 15 years of producing this kind of stuff. We get better and better at it every year we do it. That's what I tell my staff. 1 year from now, how are we going to be better at producing this information and making it useful for legislators? You've got to keep working on that kind of a concept here. So let's take a look at a couple of those things that were on that list right there. This is from our July 2011 results. Again, we're looking at the crime topic. What are evidence-based things that work to reduce crime? I don't care whether it's in the adult offender sector, juvenile offender, or if you can do it as a prevention program. I just want to reduce crime. I want to know when the crime is reduced and so on, but I want to know where are my best deals for reducing crime, because I want to put together a portfolio of programs in all those sectors that will allow me to have a nice forecast of where crime will be in taxpayer spending. So here's one program in the adult offender sector, cognitive behavioral treatment. There are various name brands that go under this thing. When we meta-analyze them, we find there's no difference among the name brands, so we put them all together in here. Here's what the numbers would indicate. I went out and read many studies, I think about over 70 studies that I found, and most of them more than half of them were lousy research. I wouldn't have felt comfortable going to my legislature saying this proves this or doesn't, because they don't have comparison groups. It's almost anecdotal evidence. I throw them out. But I found 36 studies from around the world, a lot of them from the U.S., some of them from Washington State, that were done of cognitive behavioral programs, both in the prison setting and the community setting. 36 reasonably rigorous, some of them random assignments, so some of them very rigorous, and some of them quasi-experimental studies. The expected effect, when we meta-analyze that, is about a 6% reduction in the rate of criminal recidivism. Not technical violations of parole or community supervision conditions, but new criminal acts. 6% reduction. So my heart was hoping for 60%. I really, it would have been fantastic, a 60% reduction. But my meta-analytic head said, if you're going to testify in front of Senator Hargrove's committee, you better say 6%, not 60%. Not what my heart wants to say, you better say what your head wants to say. That if we do cognitive behavioral program in Washington and we're no different than the average person that has tried cognitive behavioral therapy. I hope Washington's better, but I'm only going to plan on us being average. Then we better expect a 6% reduction. Not very much. And so you say, well, is it even worth it? Is it worth it to do that program? And that's really where the economics kicks in. If you do the economics from that, we find out that this program is really worth it. It doesn't cost very much to deliver. It's done in groups. And that 6% reduction is quite a few crimes, actually, and some of them are very serious crimes. So we think that taxpayers benefit to the tune in present value terms of $2,500, and crime victims benefit to the tune of $8,000 in terms of expected crime avoided there. So the net result is this program looks very good. We also do a risk analysis. I hope everyone is aware now that in the housing bubble and all the problems on Wall Street and in the financial centers, not enough attention was placed on the riskiness of investments. And everybody that does a benefit cost analysis, I think, should do risk analysis, and that's what we do. We do Monte Carlo simulation of all the things that go into the model there, and what we're trying to solve for there is if everything goes wrong, if we're on the wrong side of that, if it's instead of at 6%, it's only 1% reduction in crime, and all the other things that we model here, what's the chance that this program actually loses money, doesn't even break even, given that $217 investment, and it's about 1%. So it's a good investment. High expected rate of return, almost 99% chance of success as measured by positive net present value, only 1% chance of failure. So it's one that bubbles up to the top of our list. It's something we ought to be doing and are doing in our portfolio. I'll look at the other ones here. I won't go into them here. We don't have time. Some of them work, some of them don't. Intensive supervision, probation, or parole, where the focus is on surveillance, not treatment, just counting contacts is the terminology. 23 studies, random assignment studies, actual increase of recidivism, criminal recidivism a little bit more, and so any money you spend on is likely to be a loser, or 90% chance of failure in that thing. So we stopped doing that. We only do supervision now when we can link it up with treatment. Some of the juvenile offender programs look even better. Not as much research here. So the error variance gets bigger, more risk because you don't have as many studies to place your hat on, your bet on. But some of the returns so far look to be bigger. So it seems like you can get a bigger effect with juvenile offenders, and since you're getting juvenile offenders earlier in their life cycle criminal career, the benefits are also greater here because you're avoiding more crimes with those programs for youth. So what we've done with this kind of information, I'll just round out here, prevention programs also look very good. I won't go into any detail on these at this time, but preschool programs, various kinds of home visiting programs look like nurse-family partnerships look awfully good to us, both as crime-fighting resources and all the other things that we monetize in terms of their ability to improve education and child welfare outcomes. But we've used this information to craft a portfolio. And we've shifted some money out of the adult system and put it into the juvenile system because it looks like we're getting bigger returns there. If we want to keep that crime rate going down over the long term, we got to shift our portfolio a bit, and that's what we've been doing in the state of Washington. We've also been shifting it out of some prison. I didn't put prison up here, but we've got economics of prison figured out, I think, and so on. So the little cheat sheet here on things that I've learned in 15 years, this is what I learned on summer vacation, that kind of thing, about what works and what doesn't. First of all, risk. Focus on high risk. This is almost a no-brainer, but do an assessment. Focus on high-risk offenders. Don't focus on low-risk offenders from the standpoint of crime avoidance. It's hard to make those programs work cost-beneficially, and it's much easier to have them work cost-beneficially with high-risk offenders. So seems like a no-brainer, but Metro public policy, you like to work with people that don't really have problems because they're good people, and that's the wrong kind of public policy. So you have to guard against that. Treatment delivered with fidelity, very important to say with fidelity. We'll be able to talk about that a little bit more. We've learned lessons the hard way that when we just say go do something, but we don't actually have a Starbucks kind of like fidelity place, you don't get results. So this has become a very important element in our approach to criminal justice in Washington State, is to not only do something, tell the agencies through our budgets to do something, but actually order up that they do a Starbucks-like fidelity. How are you going to replicate this program over and over again? How are you going to hire and fire the workers that you want to have delivering the programs? Punishment, of course, a big part of the criminal justice system is punishment, putting people in prison, as you can see from our incarceration rates. What we're learning there and what we're adopting in the policy on the margin, it's a harder sell here, but we're doing it, is that you want to focus on the certainty of punishment. There's a much greater evidence that you'll reduce crime if you focus on the certainty and the swiftness of punishment as opposed to the severity of punishment. And that often means length of sentence. So if you're going to reduce your prison population, it's better to reduce length of stays of prison populations and shift some of those monies into other kinds of programming that give a higher return on investment. So there's a way to punish smarter, and this has become a popular phrase in the U.S. these days, especially because we have such a high incarceration rate. We've got things happen. So another thing that happens, diminishing returns. I'm an economist. If you did any economics training, every economist is going to tell you about diminishing returns. Nothing good goes on forever. That's why economists don't get invited to parties, because parties always go downhill after a while. You got to leave those damn parties. You get tired of them. Something else comes up. Every business understands this. Starbucks understands this. They can only cram so many stores into Sydney before those profits per store start going down, because you start to saturate the market. We have to understand that same principle applies in prison. You can put too many prison cells in your jurisdiction, and each prison cell starts to reduce less and less amount of crime as you go along. Same way what works on the programs. As you begin to saturate a population with cognitive behavioral treatment, you can expect the expected effect of those to go down. This is the way the world works. If the world didn't work this way, if diminishing returns didn't happen, Bill Gates would have ended up owning the whole world, because he would have had enough money and he would have been able to, but his ability to control world diminishes. He doesn't anticipate things that Google did and Steve Jobs did, and so his ability, they go downhill as well. Diminishing returns happens, economists, is the dismal science. So that's why benefit cost analysis is needed. You really, as we saw with cognitive behavioral treatment, that's why I really recommend that you get this kind of enterprise going here in Australia or New Zealand if you're here, Korea. You really got to do some cost-benefit analysis in order to find out where your best deals are. You can't just say who's got the biggest effect size, because it might cost too much to do that, or it might have a big effect size, but it's on some kinds of crime that aren't very important to crime victims. So you really want to focus on the benefit cost analysis. We found it to be a very important aspect of our work. Our legislature then has taken this information, and we've made some major changes in terms of passing this information laws. We began in the juvenile justice system. That was the original assignment, and then the legislature took our results in the late 1990s and the 2000s, and it continues on to be a bulwark of what we're doing today. Even in the face of budget cuts, we've been increasing our investments in those juvenile programs that you saw up earlier on. We think that today our budget deficit would be quite a bit worse had we not been doing those programs over the last decade. The 2002 legislature took our advice about reducing sentences for low-risk drug offenders. We put drug offenders in prison of certain types. And so we reduced the sentences lengths, took some of that fiscal savings, and shifted them into a higher return drug treatment kind of programs, drug court kind of programs. So that was a pure portfolio shift of money that we were spending to incarcerate drug offenders, take those savings and put them into the treatment of other drug offenders. We think Washington is benefiting from that today as well. The 2007 legislature is when this portfolio thing really got going. It was before the recession. There was extra money around. The legislature really upped the amount of money that we spend on preventing crime in the adult system, the juvenile system, and in the prevention system as well with that. And as a result of that, we're now have taken one prison that we would have otherwise built off the drawing boards. It was slated to be constructed. We stopped it in anticipation of the savings of this. So we think that is a net thing that has happened there. Early child education, I won't go into these other things here. Early child education also comes out very high on our economic analysis, and our legislature has taken some real steps now to include that in our definition of basic education, a legal constitutional definition of what constitutes a basic education that has to be funded. And in the 2011 and 10 and what will now be the 2012 session, where it's all about budget cuts, this kind of information, evidence, and cost-benefit analysis has been used more than ever. The demand for our work by our legislature has been increasing, not decreasing, during these economic tough times, because they have to make really tough decisions, and that's where economics appeals to both parties. Republicans and Democrats can agree that we want less crime, but we want to do it at less cost, and so that's where this kind of information helps both parties pass things through their caucuses. Doing them. So I was trained to as an economist to help pick things, and just personally I enjoy working with members of the legislature, so working with them as they pass them is a great fun. The thing I don't like doing is doing them. I like doing all the fun work. Doing them, though, is critical. If you don't focus on evidence about how you do the programs with fidelity, nothing on that list will end up making much difference as it turns out. So these are the things that I think I've learned over that time. One is to assess for risk. We talked about this a moment ago. You need to assess for risk. We have now got in place in both our juvenile systems and in our adult system formal tools, actuarially-based psychometric tools, to make sure that we're getting the right offenders with the right resources and not putting the resources on the wrong offenders. And it's a very important thing to do. You can't just leave it out to the goodwill of the judges or social workers to treat the right person. You really do have to have a formal system in place to make sure to help guide those decisions about where you apply the resources. It's critical. Another thing I mentioned earlier is the Starbucks thing, the fidelity to the model programs, whatever you adopt, how they're manualized, however you get the programs in place. This is what we've learned really the hard way in Washington State, and we've gotten really a lot better at it, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, at doing the programs with fidelity, making sure that, in my own signature on that thing was, if I could see people being fired, then I knew that we actually had a fidelity system in place that was working. You don't ever fire, because you have 100 people, you're going to have people that don't do it the way you want to do it. You have to move people on, and so that we've been able to see some of those kinds of markers there where it's worked out. And then you don't have this problem here in New South Wales. I don't know about the other states, but we have a mixed local and state government system, and you have different decision makers in there, and so you got to get the right funding streams so that the incentives are right, that local authorities, local cities and counties in my state don't have the disincentive to not do the programs that you're sending them money for, and you got to get those funding formulas with the right kinds of indicators in there to make them compete with each other to get those funds on the right things like risk and doing the programs with fidelity. So very important to get the right incentive. So this is all the boring stuff. Believe me, it's a lot of fun for me to pick them, do all that analysis, read all the studies. That's fun. This is boring meetings in rooms with boring people that I don't really want to be around, and a lot of negotiations to try to come up with something that actually works. But you got to do this. If you don't do this, all the fun stuff of picking them and watching them go through legislature and working with members of the legislature, it's not going to happen. So you got to have the whole part. You got to pick them, you got to pass them, you got to do them. And if you do that, you might be able to hold them accountable. So this is what we've been able to do. We're now in the case of crime. This is the first time we ever did. When I started my career way back in 1976 for the state budget office, where I worked for a couple of years, this was sort of a dream that several of us had at that time. Why don't we take all the money that we're spending and actually tie it into the budget preparation for future budgets so that we can kind of hold these things accountable? If these things are supposed to reduce crime, why don't we take that reduction and plan on building budgets around that reduction of crime? And we're starting to do that now, finally, 30 years later, to do it. But we actually make a formal process now in the state of Washington, goes through with all the agencies there to do it, and we adjust our prison forecast depending on the programs that the legislature has funded. And it's an annual process. We just went through it, and it dictates how many prisons we will be building in the future as a result of those estimates. So just a couple of numbers here to kind of wind up a little bit. There's our incarceration rate. So, we went up higher. This is Washington's incarceration. How many people do we have incarcerated per average daily population? The scale for Washington is 1 to 4. If I was from Texas, I'd have to draw the scale out here to 7 or 8. It'd be a much bigger. They incarcerate more people than we do here. Here's our crime rate in Washington, and then those serious crimes that we saw earlier on the slide there. Let's take a look at some things. If you think that prison doesn't work, you'd expect a very flat line there. That no matter what kind of policies you did to adjust your incarceration rate, the crime rate wouldn't be affected by that. If you think that prison really works, just put more people in prison, crime goes down, then you'd expect to see a pretty steep line there. Even if you get tough on crime and you raise your incarceration a little bit, crime will just plummet. As it turns out, like many things in life, truth seems to be somewhere in the middle of those two extreme positions. And this is what we find for Washington. These are descriptive numbers. We do a full econometric results here. This is just the raw numbers here. From 1980 to 1984, we began to increase our incarceration rate, and our crime rate was going down, sort of in the between those two extreme positions. We did some sentencing things back then to decrease our incarceration rate, and crime rate began to increase a little bit again. And then as we noted, we got tough on crime, especially in the 90s. We started to increase our incarceration rate, and the crime rate went down pretty much along that kind of a line right there. So we do an econometric analysis for Washington. There's been about 22 credible studies on that relationship around mostly the United States, some other countries as well. And this is a slope that we tend to see there, an elasticity that comes out at about the same amount in our state as it has in other states. So it looks like there's a relationship there. You put more people in prison, the crime rate goes down. If you put everybody in prison, you have a 100% incarceration rate, the crime rate as we measure it will be zero. If you let all 18,000 people until you have a 0% incarceration rate, I guarantee the crime rate will be higher next year because we know about, let alone the recidivism rate of those people, let alone the deterrent effect. So this seems to be, like an iron law of incarceration. But look at what's happened since. We're moving into a better place in the state of Washington. We're no longer increasing our incarceration rate, but we're getting a substantial reduction in our crime rate without having to increase our incarceration rate. If we had wanted to get this incarceration rate out of 2010, we would have had to build several new prisons to get our incarceration rate that high. We'd have gotten tough on a whole bunch of new crimes. It would have been very expensive. Instead, we're getting the lower crime rate without having, in fact, we're starting to reduce our incarceration rate, and that's the reason why we're starting to save money in the system there. And we're doing it in part because some of the policies that we just enunciated there in terms of the programming, and in part for things that I don't understand yet about what's going on there. It's very good news for the state of Washington. If you're an economist, we're shifting our demand curve here. We're dropping down to a new and better place you want to be, less crime and less need to build prisons. And we're starting to figure it out. Part of the reason there that is the programs that we talked about. Part of the reason is how we're restructuring our sentencing system and the focus on risk of offenders and that kind of thing. So very good, encouraging news for Washington. The kind of big picture numbers that I look for when we try to see were all the individual things we're doing rolling up. We also keep track of the amount of prison beds that we avoid. As of 2011, this year, we think there are about 1,100 fewer people in Washington prisons than there would have been had we not been doing that portfolio of programs that I mentioned, both in the prevention, not so much in prevention yet, they're going to be down the road, the juvenile system and the adult system. We're avoiding the number of beds, and that's going to grow into the future as long as we continue to fund those programs at their current level. So we're starting to see some of the tangible results that we had anticipated to see at the aggregate level, which is always, these are the kind of charts that can help legislators sort through whether what they're doing makes sense or not. So to summarize, I think the smart government, and I'm hoping that Washington State is one, I'm hoping that you hope your governments are going to be one or are one. I think the smart government will recognize that it's increasingly possible to use rigorous evidence to identify what works and what doesn't work. We have our own way of going about doing that in Washington, but we're definitely in the business of trying to figure out what does research indicate works or doesn't work, in this case to reduce crime, but we're doing it in education, child welfare, substance abuse and mental health, and so on, other areas of government policy. It's even possible then to increasingly possible to do benefit cost analysis on many of those outcomes. Some outcomes economists don't know yet how to monetize, but many of them we think we do, or at least well enough to help inform public policy making, and we can do that with a consistent model, and then to actually have the evidence used in policy making. We didn't get a chance to talk today about all the fun stuff you do working with individual members as they sort through things, but but the work is definitely being used in Washington State as a result of that. It's also important to be patient. Public policy is really people business. It's that minister that was here talking to his other people, and they're not robots. They're not cost benefit robots. You don't give them a number and things happen. It's all about the interaction there. So in baseball, in America, baseball is very popular. You can go to the Hall of Fame. You can be one of the greatest baseball players ever if you're just successful about 35% of the time, which means you fail 65% of the time. So my batting average, I hope, is a little bit better than that with my legislature, but I don't have a perfect batting average. There's no crying in baseball, and there's no crying in cost-benefit analysis. You get the best numbers you have. The legislature doesn't always respond to them, and you go back to the dugout, and you get ready to bat the next time around to do the next thing here. So you got to be patient with this stuff. It doesn't happen automatically. So I talked about, that's what I do. If you're interested in finding our stuff here, you can go get our reports. This is a boring, dumb-looking government report. I've been doing this for 35 years. I know how to write boring, dumb-looking government reports. I've gotten really good at it. If I didn't get really good at it for 35 years, I should have gone into ballet dancing or something like that. So I know how to do it. The report's there. But what it really is that Consumer Reports thing. So there's the annual auto issue from 2005. Unbiased ratings and reviews, 222 models, exclusive reliability, all that stuff. But let's just have a little PowerPoint fun to close here. We'll have the annual criminal justice issue, exclusive ratings, over 200 crime-related programs and policies. Best 2011 crime policies adopt. That's the state capital of Olympia, right in Washington, right there. Unbiased ratings and reviews, 222 programs. Best and worst programs. Don't get ripped off. Save thousands of taxpayer dollars. Best programs that reduce crime in the state. That's what I really do. But I didn't want to get sued by Consumer Reports, and I didn't want to get fired by my legislature, so I wrote this boring, dumb-looking government report. But it's really the same thing, and it's listing out things, trying to go through the process to do that. If you want to go to our webpage, you can grab this information here. I hope it's useful for you, and be happy to talk to more of you during the rest of the session. It's terrific to be here in Australia, and I know it's going to be sunny sometime while I'm here. Thanks very much. There's my